The following message by John Marriott was delivered at the 2014 Iron Sharpens Iron Conference at Emmaus Bible College. The title of his message is Defending Orthodoxy in a Politically Correct World.
Yesterday we kind of left the things hanging. I said that I would finish things off in the evening, but I forgot that I was speaking this morning and not in the evening. And just to remind you where we were, we talked about worldviews and why they matter, and the backdrop of why they matter is because we want to be a certain kind of a person. That's the goal of the Christian life. It's not just to know more stuff. It's not just to have correct beliefs, even though that's important in who we will ultimately be. It's much more than that. And if we're going to be a certain kind of person, the person that is conformed to the image of Jesus, we need to focus on more of a holistic approach, I think. Perhaps worldviews don't matter so much because there has been an overemphasis on the cognitive aspect of our being. The focus on worldview and what we think is really important. Remember, the psalmist says, "For whatever a man thinks in his heart, so he is." And yesterday we focused on the thinking part and saw that worldviews impact every area of our life, even areas that we don't think about. We assume all kinds of things. Those form the fundamental presuppositions of what we ultimately believe on our conscious level, and those things that we end up doing. Where we give our money, who we choose to associate with, what do we do with our time. But there's this other aspect of us that the psalmist also refers to. He says, as a man thinks in his heart, so he is. And I'd like to take a look just briefly at that this morning as maybe perhaps a counterbalance to the slight over-evaluation of the cognitive aspect of our being. So here's why worldviews, even though they matter incredibly, maybe don't matter as much, or maybe other things matter equally. So let me put it this way. Other parts of us matter just as much as how we think. This is why in Proverbs, Solomon says, guard your heart, because out of it flow the issues of life. I think this is why Jesus says, where your treasure is, where your vision of the good life is, there your heart will be also. Not just your mind, just not your thinking, although that's very important. So the goal of the Christian life is conformity to Jesus, and before we are thinking things, we're actually feeling things and doing things, and more importantly, loving things. One of the hallmarks of the Enlightenment, this period of modernity that emphasized reason and science and objectivity and really shunned the idea of any sort of beliefs based on religion or tradition or authority, was that the essence of a human being is that we are thinking things. Sorry for the side trail in philosophy here, but René Descartes, the French philosopher who said, I'd like to come up with an argument for the existence of God that doesn't rely on anything except very obvious, clear truths that everybody would accept, and then just building on those logically up to the existence of God. And he said, well, how am I going to do that? And he said, there's lots of things that I really think I know, but I don't. What do I know with certainty? And he said, well, I could doubt the existence of the external world. Maybe I'm in a dream. I could doubt the existence of my body. Maybe I don't really have one. But he said, here's the one thing I can't doubt, that I'm thinking. And that is where the famous saying, I think, therefore I am, comes from. If I'm thinking, there must be a thinker. And if there's a thinker, then there's me. From that very slender reed, he argued up to the existence of God. Now, his argument was really quite poor, and has been shown to be fallacious by lots of other folks. But he really sets the agenda for the next 100, 200 years of what human beings are. We are essentially thinking things first and foremost. But I don't think that's a very holistic picture. Now, worldviews focus on the thinking part of us. And since that is a major part of our constitution, then we need to really focus on worldview, because yesterday we saw how they impact so many things. But before maybe we're thinking things, we're actually people who process information emotionally before we process it intellectually often. And we're also people who are shaped far more by our desires and our loves and our practices than we are necessarily propositional truths. So we need to pay attention to these precognitive or kind of subconscious parts of us with the goal in mind that we want to be a certain kind of person. So just for a few minutes, and then we're going to move on to talk about defending orthodoxy in a pluralistic world. And by the way, you should always, if you're ever at a conference, finish your first message in the first session and your second message in the second session, so you don't have to concentrate on two messages in the same session. All right. A friend of mine by the name of Todd Hall, who is known to folks here at Emmaus, who is a counselor, who is a psychologist, and who is a very fine evangelical conservative brother. As a matter of fact, we go to church with him. We're in each other's homes quite regularly. Todd is quite well known in the Christian world and in these circles that he travels in for his work in what he calls implicit and explicit knowledge. And what he means by that is that we have explicit knowledge. That's the stuff that you kind of know and you can clearly articulate in your head. But he talks about the fact that we know things emotionally as well. There's an implicit knowledge that sometimes we can't put into words, but that we just seem to either know or that we deep down really believe. And those have not been framed by maybe intellectual disciplines, but they've really been framed and they've been formed by our relational interaction sometimes with other people. Let me give you an example of how this affects the kind of people that we are and our relationship to God. You would not maybe be surprised to find out that many of the people who I've spoken to who have lost their faith come from broken homes. There is a certain emotional aspect that they don't put into words, that is not cognitively before the forefront of their mind, why they don't believe in God. When I talk to them, they tell me all the reasons why they don't believe in God, the explicit cognitive knowledge. But what I'm really hearing oftentimes is a deep emotional problem that they have with this authority figure that is in their life, and they relate to God primarily because they see in their parents a sort of representation of who God is. And they process emotionally, before they process cognitively, what God is actually really like. This is why, and we all know this to be true, this is not controversial, this is why we all say we need to live our Christian life, we need to live before the Lord, before our children in ways that will cause them to see that what we believe is actually true. And an example that I think just really struck me yesterday, I was talking with Steve Sanchez, and we were in the cafeteria, and we were talking about all of the laws. They're not really the laws. They're the instructions that God gives the people of Israel about the tabernacle. And Steve is, mentioning some of these instructions about the tabernacle, and we all know them. We come from the assembly background. We can give you the typology of even the tent peg that sticks out of the ground of the tabernacle, and how it represents Jesus in some kind of a way. And I say that jokingly, not kicking dogs or anything. When I look at those, you know what I think when I immediately process those? Not cognitively, I process that emotionally. And here's the thought that actually, when I think about it, comes to my head. Why do I find that so unattractive, all those laws and rules? Because I see it as just one more way that you can screw up. You know what Steve says? You know how Steve reads that passage? That this is the grace of God coming down and living with his people. And so the tabernacle is a picture of the goodness and the grace of God coming down and living with his people. I see it as, this is just God giving them one more set of rules that they can't follow up on, and then when they do it wrong, God's going to be angry with them. And you know why I process it that way? Because some of the very most influential, formative people in my life were also very critical people, and would also find lots of ways to point out where you didn't do things correctly. My whole view of God is tainted by the formative relationships that I have in my life. And I process some of the things I read in the Bible emotionally before I process them cognitively. And I think that we all do that, which tells me that I need to stop and I need to reflect on the emotional component of my life and ask myself, and in dialogue with other people, do I see this correctly? Is this right? Because if I want to be conformed to the image of Jesus, I have to love him. And when I read the New Testament, sometimes the lenses that I read it through, the emotional lenses I read it through, sometimes, to be quite honest with you, I see him as not always that loving. But that's my problem, because he is really loving. But I focus on things like, how is this my problem, woman, that Jesus says? Or when he calls a Syrophoenician woman a dog and says, why should we give the food to the children to the dogs? Those are the kinds of things that emotionally I grab onto. So we need to pay attention to that aspect of us as well if we want to be people who are conformed to Jesus. Not just the cognitive beliefs that we're explicitly aware of, but some of the emotional issues that we bring to reading the text. And lastly, your handout might say head, heart, feet, but good alliteration would be head, heart, hands. And so I've changed it, to hands. So don't be looking for feet, look for hands. A former Emmaus student, a graduate of Emmaus by the name of James K.A. Smith, or for those of you who are familiar with him, his name is Jamie Smith, has gone on to have a really prodigious writing career. He's now a professor at Calvin College. He's been at a number of other different universities. He has a PhD in philosophy. He's a real brilliant guy. Has written a trilogy of books. And his argument in those books, and the first one is called Desiring the Kingdom, is this. And I think that he hits on something really important. He says that before we're thinking things, analyzing arguments, and before we're people who are really cognitive, what we are is we're desiring beings. We're loving beings, because God designed us and created us to be in a loving relationship. We are worshipers, really, before we're anything else. And that's not a new concept either, that we worship what we love. But Smith's argument is that at the fundamental level, we're people who are lovers, and we love images and things that we find beautiful and attractive and that capture our imagination. Now, in a pre-fall world, the thing that our love would be directed to and that would capture our imagination and that would shape us and form us as people would be God himself. But in a post-fall world, what captures our love, what grabs our imagination, oftentimes is not God. We are always loving something. Our love is always directed at an ultimate end, a picture of what is the good life, the flourishing. But it's not always the right thing. So what sets us off on these wrong directions? And Jamie Smith argues it's not the cognitive all the time, or even primarily, but it's our practices and our habits. That being born into a world, such as we are here in 21st century, early 21st century America, we are swimming in worldviews that are cultural and that are not necessarily theological or philosophical. And we can't escape it. And our practices and our habits cause us, if we are unreflective and we don't pay attention, to unwittingly believe in pictures of the good life that are not the good life that the Bible portrays. And he gives a very excellent example. He says, one of the practices and the habits that we just can't avoid, but that is very formative to us, is going to the mall. Everybody has to shop. But if you step back and reflectively look at the mall, what is the mall really trying to tell you? It has a picture of what the good life is. It has a picture of where happiness and human flourishing is found. And if we aren't reflective, and certainly if we weren't Christians, and if we had enough money, we would probably go to the mall and we would buy the idea that, oh yes, this is what I'm supposed to look like. Oh, this is the phone that I need. Ah, this is the new computer. And we will hear in slogans, and we will see it in signs, and it is all around us in the mall, that here is the good life, and the good life is consumerism. We need to buy and get more and get better, and if you ever watch anything on TV about cell phones, you know that the next best, greatest thing comes out every day. And you need it, and you have to have it. And so if we aren't reflective about our practices, then we can unwittingly, because we just live in a culture that is inundating us with these ideas, we can also buy into an idea that this is the good life, even though we have all of these intellectual beliefs over here that says that the good life is found in trusting Jesus, following Him, walking with Him. Our worldview is that God created the world and that human beings bear His image and likeness, and that right and wrong is determined by the nature of God given in divine commands in the Bible. We can know all of these intellectually over here, but on our practical level, if we're unreflective, we will be shaped into the kinds of people that reflect the good life that our culture sells us. And Jim Van Dyne brought this out in the latest Journey magazine article. In the book Hidden Worldviews, the authors say this: what if the real competition from worldviews, what if the real competition to our worldviews that we talked about yesterday comes from worldviews we don't see at all, even if they surround us? And here's their response: we believe this is the situation. It's not the worldviews that begin as theories or intellectual systems that mold the lives and beliefs of most people. Instead, the most powerful influences come from worldviews that emerge from culture. They're all around us, but are so deeply embedded in culture that we don't see them. In other words, these worldviews are hidden in plain sight. We will occasionally call them lived worldviews because we are more likely to absorb them through cultural contact than adopt them through rational evaluation of competing theories. These lived worldviews are popular philosophies of life that have few intellectual proponents, but vast numbers of practitioners. Smith cashes it out this way: our ultimate love moves us and motivates us because we are lured by this picture of human flourishing. Rather than being pushed by beliefs, we are pulled by that which we desire. It's not so much that we're intellectually convinced and then muster the willpower to pursue what we should. Rather, at a subconscious level, we are attracted to a vision of the good life that has been painted for us in stories and images and icons. It's not primarily our minds that are captivated, but rather our imaginations that are captured. And when our imagination is hooked, then we're hooked. Those visions of the good life that capture our heart have thereby captured ourselves and begin to draw us towards them, however implicitly or tacitly. The goods and aspects of human flourishing, painted by these alluring pictures of the good life, begin to seep into the very fiber of our being, and thus govern and shape our decisions, actions, and habits. Thus we become certain kinds of people. We begin to emulate, mimic, and mirror that particular vision that we desire. Attracted by it and moved toward it, we begin to live into this vision of the good life and start to look like its citizens who inhabit the world that we picture is the good life. We become a little microcosm of the envisioned world as we try to embody it in the here and now. So many of the decisions, actions, and paths that we undertake are implicitly and ultimately aimed at trying to live out the vision of the good life that we love and want to pursue. Let me encourage you, as you go to the mall, as you watch TV, as you walk your university campuses, reflect on the vision of the good life that's being sold to you and ask, how are your habits and your practices in those environments being affected by that and thus shaping you into that kind of a person. It's a lot harder to do than saying, well, am I really subscribing to the 7 propositional beliefs of the Christian worldview? It takes personal reflection. And so worldviews are incredibly important. The cognitive, the head, is going to affect how you act. It touches on every aspect of your life. It's based on fundamental presuppositions that ultimately you can't prove and are taken by faith, but doesn't necessarily mean that they're unreasonable and that you can't give reasons for them. Worldviews impact, they answer big questions of life and thus influence all areas and aspects of life and do shape us. But likewise, so is the way that we process information emotionally and implicitly, the knowledge that we carry, that shapes us in who we are as well. And so we need to pay attention to that. And finally, we need to take a look at our practices, and some of which we just simply can't avoid. I mean, it's hard to avoid watching television or going to the mall. It's hard to avoid the internet. It's hard to avoid all kinds of different technology and the advertising world and the pictures that they paint of the good life for us. But if we need to step back and we need to analyze that, even though we're engaged in these practices, how are they shaping us and forming us? Have we bought into it? Because Jesus says, where your treasure is, where your view of the good life is, your heart is going to be also. Okay. Next. All right, this session is about defending orthodoxy in a pluralistic world. And we've already talked about what orthodoxy is. It's correct belief. It's belief that is the criterion for which is the Bible, the formation of which is the great tradition that we stand within. And we want to make sure that we are able to respond to cultural challenges that want to say, hey, you can't ever say that your worldview is the correct worldview. Your worldview is right. Because in a pluralistic world, tolerance is the most valuable virtue. So here are some questions. What is pluralism? Pluralism is simply just the condition in which numerous distinct ethnic, religious, or cultural groups are present and tolerated within a society. I heard someone joke once before that Los Angeles is the only place in the world where you can get a kosher taco served by an African-American gentleman at 3 o'clock in the morning. It's a multicultural environment. There are people who are different backgrounds religiously or different backgrounds ethnically, culturally, all living together. That's a pluralistic environment. Where I came from, it was not pluralistic at all. I would suspect that my grandmother rarely ever encountered anybody in our small town in northern Ontario who was not Caucasian European descent, unless she came across Native Canadian Indians, but they lived on the reservation, so she rarely ever encountered them either. Because she never encountered anybody different than her, she hardly ever had any doubts about who she was or what she believed. But in a pluralistic world, where there are all kinds of competing communities that claim that they have the truth, it's difficult to say that you have the truth and that even just to make the claim that you have the truth or that anybody can have the truth. I think that for a large portion, all of our young people feel this way, that there's a sense of guilt and embarrassment and maybe shame in making the claim that certain things are right and certain things are wrong. The most challenging and difficult stand that your young people and our young people and my kids are going to have is being faithful to what the Bible teaches, in my opinion, of homosexuality. This is going to be the watershed issue that is going to separate the church. And it's already begun. As you can tell, there are books on our book table addressing this issue, and I'm glad that Emmaus is. Because this will be the issue that not only brings, I think, persecution to whatever degree, to people who attempt to be faithful to their understanding of the Bible, and also a split between those who are willing to reinterpret the Bible in light of different kinds of theology. It's hard to say if you are, and please, forgive me for this, because I think that generationally we are slightly different, that I think that if you're under 30, I think that it's very difficult to make the claim that homosexual practice is immoral and is bad. I think there is such a cultural pressure that even though intellectually we might say that the Bible says that that's wrong, but in the minds and the hearts of young people, down here in their gut, there is this sense that I'm still doing something bad. I'm bigoted. Let me put it this way. The Advocate magazine, which is the gay magazine, one of the gay magazines, had on the cover, "Gay is the new black." Now, when you make the connection in your mind to how we would view people in the United States who were pro-slavery and segregation, we would say, I would never want to be identified with those people. What those people did was bad and was really wrong. This is the same, when the argument gets cashed out that gay is the new black, this is exactly why young people feel, how can I say that this is wrong? I don't want to be on the wrong side of history. I don't want to be, how do I know I'm not just like those other people that I think are terrible back then? We live in a pluralistic world where all kinds of communities are living together and rubbing shoulders, and pluralism at the food court is fantastic. But pluralism when it comes to truth is troubling and is problematic, because it's okay to say that pluralism is a condition in which numerous distinct ethnic, religious, or cultural groups are present and tolerated in a society, but it's a completely different thing to say that it's where these things all exist in a society and they're all equally accepted as valid and true and good. Now, let me back up and clarify this. It's a different thing to say this, a condition in which numerous distinct religious claims are all equally valid. I'm not making any comments on cultural practices, ethnic backgrounds, different languages, any of those kinds of things. I'm talking truth claims. And this is the religious pluralism. This is where we really find ourselves struggling in our culture as Christians, because we're living in a culture where numerous distinct religious claims are equally valid, or perhaps equally true, or perhaps equally untrue, but none of them can say that they are really the truth. I'm going to skip the video, but I'll just briefly mention it to you. The video that I have is from the TV show Joan of Arcadia. And Joan, it was a good TV show, a moral TV show. Joan is a high school student, and God comes to her and says, Joan, you're going to be my messenger. I'm going to have you do things that I want to have done here in the town of Arcadia in California. And so Joan says, okay. And God comes to her in all different forms. So sometimes he's an old man on the park bench. Sometimes it's maybe a librarian or someone in a store. And Joan recognizes that this is God coming to her, and God comes in this anthropomorphic way and gives instruction. And in one episode, Joan is invited to a bar mitzvah, which sets off the whole discussion of religions and religious truth. And in the video, Joan encounters God at the end of the video and says, hey, look, all these religions, why couldn't you just make one? And God says, well, there are so many different people in the world, and they all relate to me in different ways. And so I needed to create different religions, because that's all that religions are. They're just different ways of relating to me, so they're really all the same. That's the best illustration of religious pluralism, is saying that all religions are the same, or that all religions ultimately perform the same kind of a function. So how in the midst of a religiously pluralistic culture can one justify the claim that any one religious view is correct? And of course we think that Christianity is true. We don't think that we have all of the right answers individually. I think that some of my theology is probably wrong. I don't know what it is, because if I did, I would change it. But I think that I'm wrong on some things. And I think that you're all wrong on some things too. And if you were wrong and you knew where you were, you would change it as well. But one thing that we're pretty convinced of is that Christianity defined as that Jesus came and died on the cross and rose from the dead, and that people need to have a relationship with God through him, is true. It is the big story that is true, and all of the other big stories and claims are false when it comes at least to that one point. They might be right on other things. Other worldviews and other religions teach true things. But when it comes down to that issue, and the issue of who God is, we think that Christianity is the true story. In the Old Testament, God says you can't have any other gods before me. In the New Testament, we're all familiar with the passages where Jesus says nobody can come to the Father except by me. There's no other name given among men under heaven whereby which you must be saved. There's only one mediator between God and man, the man Christ Jesus. The New Testament is pretty exclusive. It is not pluralistic. It doesn't offer a whole bunch of different ways to God. It says that there's only one off-ramp on this highway, and it's Jesus, and if you don't take it, then there are no other legitimate options. How in a culture that is so overly sensitive to anyone ever making truth claims, how do we go about making the truth claim and defending the claim that Christianity is true? Well, one thing that I think that we can do is we can talk about some of the problems with pluralism as a way of thinking and approaching these ideas. Simple pluralism is the argument that you might hear that says this: all religions are equally true because all religions are essentially the same. They're all really the same. I had a guy I did my student teaching under who just told me the exact line. He said, yeah, look, the Jain Buddhists and the Jews and the Christians, look, they're all just really the same. They all basically believe the same thing. We're all part of this brotherhood. Someone once said when given that line, like we're all part of the brotherhood, they said, yeah, but the problem is I see more hoods than brothers, right? There's a problem here. This is just simply false. This is just simply false. Simple pluralism is simply false because all religions are not believing the same thing. Okay? Buddhists don't believe the same thing when it comes to God as Christians do. Do you know what Buddhists believe about God? They don't. Okay? There is no God in Buddhist philosophy. None. Christians believe in God. What do Muslims believe about God? He's a monad. He's one thing. He's not a trinity, that's for sure. But Christians believe in a trinity. What's the problem in the world? Well, the problem in the world, if you are a Hindu, is that you are separated from Brahman because you are in an illusion. Buddhists say, no, that's not the right answer. The right answer to the question is what's wrong with the world is that you're ignorant and you need to be enlightened so that you can achieve nirvana. Scientologists will say that you have a thetan or number of thetans on your back. These are alien souls. And you need to become clear. Muslims say the problem is that you're unwilling to submit to God. Christians say that there's a disobedience problem, similar to Muslims, and gets explained as sin. We all don't believe the same things. Is Jesus a good prophet and a good teacher, like secular humanists might believe? Not a prophet, but a teacher. Is he a prophet and a prophet only, even though an exalted one, like Muslims believe? Is he perhaps a blasphemer and deserving of his punishment, like Orthodox conservative Jews might believe? Is he the supernatural virgin-born Son of God, like we would believe? This is just simply false. You cannot say that all religions believe the same thing. And all religions, by the way, are exclusive. It's not just Christianity. Even some of the most tolerant and open-minded ones are not the same and are exclusive. The Buddha left Hinduism, which is where he came out of, because he rejected the caste system and he didn't think that the Vedas were really scripture. And so he said, I reject that, and I'm going to separate and start my own way of thinking. It's not just monotheistic religions like Christianity, Judaism, and Islam that are exclusive. Every worldview and every worldview and religion has a point of exclusivity, and if you look long enough, you'll find it. To say that all religions are equally true because all religions are essentially the same, is to say more about the ignorance of one's knowledge of worldviews and of religions than it is really to say anything about the religions themselves. Now, there is a more nuanced version of pluralism. It's going to say, look, we recognize that religious claims are incompatible. That Christianity and Judaism and Islam and Shintoism and Taoism and Greek polytheism are not the same. They make different claims, and those claims can't be harmonized. So they're not really the same. But we do want to say that all religious claims are equally false, because all they are is genuine attempts to speak of the eternal one. John Hick, who used to be an evangelical and who became a religious pluralist, came to the position and the belief that when you look around at all of the different religions in the world, you realize that even though their doctrines and their beliefs are incompatible, they all seem to be doing the exact same thing, producing the same kind of people. You look at the Dalai Lama and you say, wow, look at that. He's a very virtuous and moral person who cares for people and loves other people. And they say, oh, Mother Teresa, very similar. And you can go through all the different religions of the world and find their exalted folks and characters, and we look at them and say, it's hard to say who's doing a better job here of producing good people. Maybe all religions, even though they're incompatible, are just attempts to speak of this eternal being who's really out there. And even though the beliefs are incompatible and they're all equally false, they kind of are different vehicles that can be used to become a certain kind of person that maybe reflects the eternal one. This is John Hick's position. It's a religious pluralist position that's a bit more nuanced. He doesn't say that all beliefs are the same. He says that they're all equally false because, well, we really can't know God. We really can't encounter God. We only encounter God through our tradition or through our faith or through some kind of a text. We never encounter God actually. So religions are good ways of making good people, is his argument. The problem with this, though, it seems to me, is that this is quite an arrogant claim. Everyone else is wrong here. All of these religions worldwide are all wrong, but the pluralist actually sees it for what it is. Despite the fact that the argument is that we can't really know ultimate reality, and we only know reality through our traditions and through our culture and through our revelations, we don't really know reality, but the pluralist kind of seems to say that he does know reality, and he sees things kind of the way that they are. He has sort of the God's eye view and looks down and says, oh, those poor religious people, they don't realize that, they're really not all that different. But I do, because I see things the way that they are. The pluralist claims that there is a reality and that all religions are groping after it. But how does the pluralist actually know this? Because there's lots of different ways you can explain religion. Their assumption is that religion is an expression of people groping after the one eternal being that is out there. But why assume that there's a one eternal being out there? Why not just say religions are just sociological ways that people find meaning in life, or that they're just the product of evolution, or they're just a psychological salve for the insecurity and meaninglessness of a universe? Why should you assume from a pluralist position that there actually is this eternal one being who's out there? How does he know that? According to the pluralist, the only reason that people believe what they do about God and their religion is that they're the result of being raised in a certain time in a certain place. Have any of you heard this before, that if you were born in India, you'd be a Hindu? Right. Well, the argument is this: you're an exclusivist because you were born into an exclusivist religion, or you converted into one maybe. But you only believe that because this is the kind of world that you were born into. The pluralist says, that this is their diagnosis of things. But can't the same argument be made back to the pluralist that says you're only a pluralist because you're in 21st century United States of America, and then if you were born in Victorian England, you wouldn't be a pluralist, you'd be an exclusivist. So how do you know that your that your view on this is correct? Let me just say that one more time. The argument is this, that you can't say that Christianity is true and that you have the market in the corner on truth, because the only reason you are a Christian is because you were born into Christian America. But the same argument can be, and he says, so the pluralist has the right view on it. The pluralist has got the truth. The question can be turned back on him. The same accusation can be made. Pluralism must be false, and your understanding of things must be false, because the only reason you're a pluralist is because you were born here and you were born now. And if you were born somewhere else at another time, you would never be a pluralist. It does not follow simply because you can explain the origin of a belief that you've shown the belief to be false. Just because you can show how a belief originated doesn't mean that it's false. That might be very well true that the only reason, not the only reason, but let's just bracket out theological ones for a moment, that the main reason why I'm a Christian is because I was born in Northern Ontario into a Christian family that went to a Christian church in a pretty much predominantly Protestant town. But what does that have to do with whether or not what I believe is true? Nothing. It has nothing to do with it. All you've said is, here's the reasons maybe why you're a Christian, but it has nothing to do with truth. So the argument, the nuanced pluralistic argument I just think that it simply fails. Now, some of the things that you might hear that maybe would be a little bit more common would be this. Exclusivism is immoral, and it's immoral to hold exclusivist religious claims because that is being intolerant and judgmental. Right? This is one that for sure we're all familiar with. But how does it follow that just because not everyone agrees with you, that you are being intolerant and judgmental? Not everybody agrees with pluralism either, but that doesn't make them intolerant and judgmental. Just because you hold a particular belief that not everyone agrees with does not make you a bigot, does not make you intolerant, does not make you judgmental. Sometimes people say, but you know what, unless you can prove your belief empirically, unless you can demonstrate it maybe scientifically or with hard factual evidence, then you can't make an exclusive claim. So, for example, we might be able to say some science claims can be exclusively true. We can rule out other theories because we have proven this with empirical evidence, theory number one. But the problem is we hold to things all the time, pretty much exclusively, without empirical evidence. Do you all believe that all doors have two sides? Have you done an empirical study of all doors? Have you gone around and looked at all doors? No, you haven't. But do you believe that? Sure you do. Of course. What about the fact that the sun will rise tomorrow and all the laws of the universe will keep operating the same way in the future as they have in the past? Can you prove that empirically with science? No, you can't do that. But do you believe that the universe will keep operating the same way in the future as it has in the past? Sure you do, because when you bake bread in the future, you say, hey, this recipe worked in the past. When I put these ingredients in, I expect the same result. And when NASA shoots the space shuttle up, they don't say, gee whiz, I hope that the laws of the universe don't change tomorrow when we shoot the space shuttle up because we're operating on these old ones back here. But you cannot empirically prove that the universe is going to be the same in the future as it was in the past. So when people say it's immoral to be an exclusivist because you can't prove your claims scientifically, you can't even prove that the claim that you need to use science as a criterion with a science experiment. That's a philosophical assumption. Genuine tolerance, as opposed to its pale counterfeits, requires us to allow those who espouse or live out ideas we think wrong, perhaps even harmful, not only to do so, but also to try to persuade others to do the same. Daniel Taylor, professor at Bethel College up in Minnesota, says that the whole concept of tolerance has really changed over time. He says this: first, tolerance is only, one is not tolerant of something unless one objects to it. You have to object to something to tolerate it. If you invite me over to your house for dinner and then you serve chocolate ice cream afterwards, I won't tolerate the chocolate ice cream. I will just eat it all up because I like it. I have no objections to chocolate ice cream. If you were to serve me, I don't know, liver and things that I don't like, I would tolerate it, but I wouldn't like it. I would eat it, but it wouldn't really be my favorite. Today, tolerance means full acceptance, perhaps even celebration. But historically, the definition of tolerance was that even though you didn't like something, even though you didn't approve of something, you allowed it to go on without forcibly coercing someone to stop their behavior. Now, there are some things that we don't tolerate, and they're inscribed in our laws. So, everybody is intolerant at some point in the old definition of the word. But today, unless you're fully accepting or you're celebrating a particular behaviors or all ideas, then you're considered intolerant. But historically, the definition would be that only people who have objections can actually be intolerant. Therefore, liberal progressive folks might actually be, ironically, the least tolerant of all people because they're not objecting to anything. Does that make sense? Right? Only people who have a particular code that they live by, a worldview, a religious perspective, who have views on moral issues and social issues can be tolerant people. Now, we don't always express that maybe the best way and in ways that are appropriate all the time, but tolerance is not full acceptance and full acceptance of all ideas. It also implies withheld power. Because if you have the power to stop someone and you don't, then to some degree you are either you're tolerating it. If you don't have the power and you can't stop it, that just means you're impotent. You have no power to do anything about it. The truly tolerant people are the people who have an objection to something and do not forcibly coerce other people, perhaps by threat or punishment, to stop believing or doing what they're doing. You can try and persuade people. You can try and pass laws by persuading and getting other people to see your point of view. But that wouldn't be intolerant. Intolerant would be shooting abortion doctors. That's intolerant. That is forcibly using an ability that you have to stop someone from doing what you don't want them to do. Everybody is intolerant of something. Everybody draws a line somewhere. Here, a few other problems for pluralism. Pluralism doesn't avoid the problem of being intolerant and judgmental anyway. Pluralists say our big problem as exclusivists, and believing there's only one truth here, is that we're intolerant and we're judgmental. So you need to be someone who's more open-minded and accepting. The problem is this. There are three ways that you can respond to an exclusivist, people like us. You can agree with them, but if you agree with them, then you are now intolerant and judgmental as well. Nobody wants to be that. You can disagree with them and say, I'm a pluralist, but as soon as you disagree with them, then you are by definition being what? Intolerant and judgmental, right? You're an intolerant and judgmental person, and we're not going to tolerate you anymore. The third way is you can just withhold judgment. But even withholding judgment on these issues is still making a judgment, and here's how. If I were to say to you, believe in Jesus or don't, you would say, well, I'm going to withhold judgment here. But in withholding judgment, you've made a decision. You're saying, I don't believe in Jesus. William James, the psychologist and sort of a philosopher who wrote quite a few famous books. He was at Princeton around the turn of the century, last century, not the 20th century, says that some decisions that we have are forced decisions upon us, and that we have to make a decision, and to withhold judgment is actually making a decision. Right? To say you either cross the river or you don't cross the river if you're going to go up the mountain. If you say, well, I'm not sure what I'm going to do, you've made a decision. You chose to not cross the river. Therefore, pluralism can't escape its own problems. It doesn't want to be intolerant and it doesn't want to be judgmental, but it has three options. It can't agree because that would be the definition of being an exclusivist. It does disagree, but that makes them intolerant and judgmental. Even withholding judgment has a certain element and taint of that as well. Now, the big problem for Christians is that we make these very particularistic claims that Jesus is the only way. And people say, how can you say that? Knowing all of the religious people that you do, all of the good folks in other religions, all the people who have never heard, it just seems to be unjust that you have to believe in Jesus, because if you were born in India, you'd be a Hindu. And it's also unloving, because what about all those people who haven't heard? What about the people who lived in Northern Ontario 10,000 years ago, supposedly, according to my local newspaper, that these people had a settlement there? Well, I think the first answer to number one is that it's unjust if Christianity is true, because, well, people are born in these different cultures in these different places and times, is something like this, is God is actually just in offering no way to have a relationship with him. He's under no obligation to reach out to human beings whatsoever. He's not obligated to save anybody. He does so simply by his grace. We are all cosmic and moral rebels towards him, and therefore deserving of whatever just punishment that he desires to mete out. To say that God is unjust because there's only one way, we should ask the question, perhaps, why does God offer any way at all? And so that's just a question of focus. Is the focus on the injustice of God or the unjust nature of God, or is it on the grace of God? And that perhaps maybe depends on how you emotionally process your view of who God actually is. The second one, it's unloving. What about those who have never heard? Has a number of assumptions built into it. One thing we might say is that we're actually not in a good place to know about the fate of those who never hear the gospel. There are some folks in our community who would be very convinced that you need to hear the gospel story, otherwise you have no hope of salvation. There are others within our community who are equally orthodox who would say there is a wideness in God's mercy, and no one in the Old Testament ever heard about the gospel story, but they did have faith in what God revealed to them. Abraham was credited with faith, with righteousness, because God promised him something about his descendants, and Abraham believed it. Is it not possible, these folks over here would say, that people who have never heard the gospel, never exposed to the gospel, are sort of living on Old Testament ground, and the revelation to which they've received, if they are responsive to it, and if they are pursuers after God, that the righteousness of Christ can be accredited to their account in the same way that it was credited to Abraham's account? I am not advocating either position. I am just saying that for people to say it's unloving because what about those who have never heard, it's a much more complicated issue. It also assumes that if they did hear, that they would believe. And in the omniscience of God, and what some people have called, what some people call his middle knowledge, his knowledge of what could possibly happen under any circumstance, is it not possible that God knows every person who would or would not accept the gospel if they heard it, and so bring a world into existence that only those people who never hear the gospel are those people who he knew would never accept it had they heard it? So God is not unjust in doing that. Now, there is a whole sort of a theology that goes along with that, and perhaps some of you wouldn't find it particularly appealing. It would be more of a kind of an Arminian theology. It's definitely more of a libertarian kind of a free will as opposed to a compatibilist theology. But the point is just simply this, is that the argument that says God is unloving and God is unjust are very simplistic. And they don't take in they certainly don't rule out exclusive truth claims. Lastly, I want to say this in closing. How do we go about making a case then for why you can say that there may be one true way of relating to God and that Christianity is it? I think we could start off by pointing out the problems with pluralism that I've tried to share this morning. That the whole pluralist mindset and worldview ends up eating its own tail. It becomes somewhat self-contradictory. It says that you need to accept all faiths, in all religions and all worldviews, except this one over here that's very exclusivist. Well, then pluralism itself becomes somewhat exclusivist and defeats itself. I think step 2, we would make a case for Christianity and why we think that it's true. But for many of the folks who are raising these objections about pluralism, they're often quite skeptical about all of the good arguments that we might have that traditional apologetics offers for why Christianity is true. They would say, yeah, of course you believe all of those arguments. You're already from within that worldview. Of course you think that these arguments make sense and the Bible is reliable and that this worldview is false, because the criteria for that you're using actually comes up out of your worldview, right? Tell someone who is of the Advaita Vedanta Hindu faith that their faith is illogical and it violates all kinds of laws of logic, and they'll just say, so what? Laws of logic aren't part of our worldview, they're part of yours. So why should a criterion from your worldview evaluate mine? I don't accept it. There are responses to that. But I think another way of making a case for folks who are skeptical and questionable about the arguments is to say something like this. It seems as though pluralism fails, and therefore there might be the possibility of there being one true way of relating to God. I think that Christianity is that way. And I think that if you listen to what I have to say, listen to me explain the story of Christianity, and look how we practice and how we talk about reality, how we go about our practices, how we understand things, that you will see a pattern in the world emerging that makes the world make much more sense than the one that you're operating in right now. Here's an example. How many of you have ever seen these kinds of things before, these magic eye things, all right? How many of you have looked at them but have never been able to see them? Me too. If you're unfamiliar with this, if you stare at that the right way, you will see a picture of something in there. And I can't tell you what it is, but I have had people in the audience look up at it and say, I know what it is. I just forget what they told me. Right? But there is a picture in there. So let's say Lisa Beatty says, you want to know what the picture is? Here's how you go about finding it. And she tells you, you have to stand on your head, you have to hold your breath, and you have to close one eye. And a picture will kind of emerge, and out of that mess, there will become a pattern that will make sense to you. And let's say you do that, and you go, maybe I kind of see something here, but it's not really bringing it all together for me. Right? And then JJ says, no, here's what you do, and he gives you a whole different set of instructions. And that kind of helps you even more. You say, well, this is better. This is a better way of looking at the picture because it brings out more of it. I sort of see more things in here. It's making more sense. But then, I don't know. Phil Boom comes along, and he says, now here's what I want you to do. Walk up to the picture, put your nose on it, cross your eyes, stare through the picture, and back up. And as you do, the picture starts to become much more clear, and the pattern emerges, and you say, I see it. It's dolphins swimming, with a bus in the background. Okay. Could you prove that to other people using logical arguments? And you might be able to do that. But I would suggest that one of the ways that we reach out to people who are really skeptical about truth claims is to say this. Relativism and pluralism fails, so that opens up the door to the possibility that there is a real truth out there. You're probably really skeptical of all my apologetic arguments, so why don't we do it sort of the Celtic way? Live in our worldview for a little while. See how we talk about the world. See how we engage with reality. See our practices and the types of people that we're becoming, and see if the world doesn't come into a pattern and make much more sense for you than perhaps the way that you're viewing the world now. Does the Christian worldview and the Christian story explain why we're broken better? Does the Christian worldview explain what is the fundamental problem with reality? Does it provide a good account for how we got here and where we're going? Does it explain the existential issues that are involved, that happen and take place in our lives? Of course, there are going to be people who are going to do exactly what we tell them to do and look at the world in this way, and they're going to come and walk away and say, I didn't see nothing. But that's not our problem, and it's not our fault. Because similarly, people are going to listen to our apologetic arguments and say, those don't make any good sense to me. So I would encourage you, as you engage with folks, to be able to articulate a reason why there might be an open door in a pluralistic world to say, yes, we can affirm that there can be a real way, a one way, a truth, a true religion. Why? Because pluralism fails. That opens the door. And here's why I think that the Christian worldview is the right one. Because I think it makes better sense out of the blooming, buzzing confusion of our world, from the physical to the emotional to the psychological to the social. And if you step into that worldview and live it for a while and try it on for size, then I think that you'll see the pattern that we see as well. And that'll convince you that it's true. Let's pray. God, thank you for my friends. I ask that you would bless them and give them a great afternoon. Would you help us to be more sensitive and aware to the argument that all religions are equal and the same, so that we would be able to say something intelligent in defense of the Christian worldview. And may we live lives that are beautiful and are attractive and winsome, so that other folks, when they look at us, will be able to say, yeah, the way they live really makes much better sense of the world than the way I'm doing it now. In Jesus' name I pray, amen.